It's March 18th. As you know, tomorrow is a national holiday because it is my birthday. It is my birthday.
Happy birthday! 19.
Alright, because it's a birthday, you need cake. So, what cake do I like? Pound cake. Get into it. And who's gonna be making the pound cake? Got Grandma right here, Go-Go, and I got Ashaki on the steps right there. They about to throw down in the kitchen. So, you know, y'all stay tuned in. It's about to be lit. You know, happy birthday to me. And let's get to it. So, all you on the shirt.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday.
Alright, bro, you're hit, bro.
Ashaki, come over here and sit next to me.
Good.
Hi, my name is Nolu, and I am pleased to say that I actually have the gift of baking. I don't take it for granted. It's a God-given gift, but anybody can bake basic stuff. What we're doing here is showing people who love to bake. The reason I got back into baking is you just can't find good baked goods anymore. I mean, if you can hardly find a bakery, and even bakeries are using cake mix. If you can imagine a bakery using cake mix. If you go to your local grocery store, they're baking stuff from plastic bags. And anyhow, baking from scratch for those who know the difference. That's what we're doing. And this video is intended for people who have never baked, love good cakes, and want to know every step from A to Z. So Ashaki is here. Sometimes he does it all by himself now. He is that good, but we're going to show you how to do it all from beginning to end. Ashaki, what do you think was the hardest part about learning how to bake?
Measurements.
Measurements. Measurements are really important with baking. I'm also a pretty good cook. And when you come to cooking, you can always add a little this, a little this. Baking is like a good cook. And when you come to cooking, you can always add a little this, a little this. Baking is like science. You really have to be very, very careful about adding stuff. If it says 3 cups of flour, you really do want 3 cups of flour. Now, unless you want to test stuff out on your own, that's another story. But anyhow, we're going to set everything up and we're going to show you how to bake a pound cake from scratch. Well, to show you that I'm a grandmother who tries to stay modern, I now keep most of my recipes either on my tablet, my phone, or my computer. It makes it easy, particularly when you're baking in other places, but of course you can always have it on paper. So one of the key things that we do is lay out the ingredients in the order in which we're using them. Now, because I have this very serious stand mixer, you really do not need to have your butter. If you could get a close shot of the butter, Allende, our cameraman, you really don't need to have the butter soft because a powerful mixer will deal with it. But if you're dealing with a hand mixer, which you can make this cake with a hand mixer, be sure your butter is at least room temperature. Whatever you do, do not try to melt it in the microwave because that will not work. I also am not at all into brands. I really just buy whatever is on sale, but just to show you, we have our sugar, we have our eggs, we have our vanilla, we have our salt. My daughter is into pink salt. It works fine. Whatever cake flour, and to tell you the truth, we've actually done this with regular flour. We couldn't really tell a difference, okay? And some of the recipes say that you need to sift the flour, and a couple of times we were busy rushing. We didn't sift the flour. We couldn't tell a difference, so I don't sift the flour anymore. 7-Up. One time I couldn't get 7-Up. I used whatever Sprite or whatever, and that seemed to work fine. Now, one of the things where the butter usually does need to be soft is when you come to butter and greasing your pan. Now, because we're making a pound cake, the bundt pan gives a very simple cake a very beautiful look. So it really makes a difference to have the butter soft when it comes to actually greasing it. Now, Ashaki laid everything out. Ashaki, do you remember how old you were when we first started baking together?
About 8.
About 8. So that's been like 8 years. It's like literally half his life he's been baking. So anyhow, Ashaki laid the ingredients out and he measured them accurately. Again, 3 cups of sugar, 3 cups of flour, cake flour or regular flour, not 3 1/2, not 3 1/4, not 4, but these things need to be measured fairly accurately. Now, one of the jobs I always give to Ashaki is greasing, or what they call buttering the pan. Now, I have tried using some of those spray things. They really and truly do not work as well as old-fashioned buttering the pan. We have found that when you actually use butter to butter the pan, when it comes to getting the cake out of the pan, it comes out really nicely and doesn't get all jacked up. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to take about this much butter. Of course, my hands have been washed. About that much butter. This part doesn't need to be measured. We're going to throw it in there, and then Ashaki, whose hands have been washed, is going to start to butter the pan. Now, just every surface really needs to be buttered, because if you miss a surface, that's where the cake is going to stick and it doesn't come out. So this part is really quite an important part of the whole cake baking process. So Ashaki has developed his own system. Back in the olden days, of course, we just did it with our hands or our fingers, and you can still do it with your hands or fingers, but this way works. So Ashaki, tell me how you developed this skill of using, this technique of using a brush as opposed to your hands.
It works faster. You can get into the crevices of the pan.
And see, that's one of the wonderful things about working with other folks. They teach you stuff, right? Because I mean, for years and decades, I just always did it with my fingers, and of course you would miss some spots, but he discovered this technique of using a little brush. Okay, so now we're doing the flouring part of the pan. I usually use about a tablespoon. Again, this part you really don't have to measure, and I just dump it in there. Now, because even myself, I can't even blame this on being young or anything. I'm just clumsy, and so when it comes to this part, I always make a mess. And especially when I'm working in other people's kitchens, such as my daughter and working with my grandson, I don't want flour all over a floor, counter, whatever. So we go outside. So if you have a balcony or whatever, you can go outside. If you're in an apartment, don't have a balcony, you can do it over the sink, which I think is probably the safest and easiest thing to clean. So now we're going to go outside and finish off the flouring of the pan. This is so critical to having the cake come out nicely. And then I always sort of drop it like that, which gets the excess flour off. And then I hand it back to Ashaki. It's usually better to start out with a little more flour than you need, 1-2 tablespoons, quarter cup or whatever, and then you just get rid of the excess. So that's what it looks like when the pan is properly buttered and floured, even though I see we did miss a couple of spots down there. But we're going to pray over it and not worry. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, if you have a good stand mixer, your butter really does not have to be at room temperature. If you're trying to do this with a hand mixer, you really do want your butter at room temperature. So here, this is probably now at room temperature just because it's been sitting there as we've been working on this. So we're turning it, and this stage is what they call creaming the butter. Now again, it will depend on the power of your mixer. This could go anywhere from 2 minutes to 5 minutes, probably not more than 5. Now you saw how the butter changed, right? But you also notice we got this big hunk of butter that's stuck in the mixer. They also don't tell you this either, but anyhow, when that happens, you just knock it down and then do it again. I love a powerful mixer. Now, as you can see, that is what, when they say creaming the butter, that's how the butter should look. You see it's a little soft. They say the color changes. I don't know, but that's what it's going to look like. Okay, that's also a very important part in the chemistry. Now we're going to have Ashaki add the ingredients. So now you're going to start adding the sugar a little bit at a time. And just to give you an idea what this looks like when they say a little bit, I usually do about 3 or 4 additions. So go ahead, Ashaki. I will also note that if you're doing this with a hand mixer, this is where teamwork really comes in. One person can be holding the hand mixer while the other person is adding in the sugar. And then you also want to do this thing what Ashaki is doing called scraping down the bowl. Because when you're using this kind of mixer, you know, the batter gets stuck on the bowl, and you want everything nicely mixed. So he just knows to do that now. So a little at a time, about 4 additions is pretty good. Especially with a pound cake, which is a very thick batter, you have to, you know, just be sort of vibrational sometimes. And feel free to stop and start as needed. And again, this time I said 4 additions, but you know, 5 or 6 additions. Again, depending on the power of your mixer.
I like to scrape down the sides before we add the eggs so everything's good.
Yeah, it's good. It mixes better when everything is properly scraped down, which you're going to see in a minute. So, okay, let's start the mixing again. And we start at this point on slow. Again, this one is not carbon concrete. I always just start on slow when I add the eggs. So, I have my eggs. 5 eggs in this recipe. I have them lined up, and I put another bowl over here just for the shells. Okay, so that's what it looks like after 1 egg is added. You see how the color is starting to change, right? And so usually you want to add them 1 at a time. Again, that's a science thing. Like, they don't want you to add all 5 at the same time because some chemical reaction is actually taking place. If you care about that, read the cake Bible. So once you add an egg, you let it mix for about a minute before you add the other egg. Okay, so we have added the eggs 1 at a time. We've mixed well after each addition. Now we add the salt, which is 1 teaspoon of salt to the flour. And then we also mix it. One of the nice things about the pink salt is you can see it. So we mix it with the flour. Now, the one thing that I did measure out in advance is the 7-Up, because, you know, it spritzes and I don't want it to go flat. So I usually open it up about this time. Now, this is the one place where I'm fudging a little bit, because the recipe, and we will have a print version of this recipe available for you, calls for 3/4 of a cup. I've always just done 3/4 of a cup. I've never tried to do 1 cup because I know it's science. Those of you who are new at this, you might want to get a 1 cup measure and actually measure out 3/4, but I think that's pretty good. Now we're going to alternate the flour with the 7-Up.
Like every other one.
Every other one. Some people say you should start with the dry ingredients and then the wet, the dry to wet. I really have not noticed any difference. We've done it both ways. So again, because this part can get messy with flour flying everywhere, it's a good idea to stop your machine or your mixing. Add in a little flour. Again, we do it maybe about 4 additions. We add it and then we mix it. Okay, so once you have added all your ingredients, you then mix it very well for about 2 or 3 minutes. Again, it depends on the power of your mixer. With a powerful mixer, certainly less than 5. If you're doing a hand mix, it may take a little more time. The other thing I forgot to point out is we forgot to add our vanilla flavor. Now, you'll see from the recipe that the vanilla should have gone in after the eggs. But some stuff, you know, just happens. So we threw in the vanilla, and I'm sure it's going to be fine. Okay. So now at this point, we're going to scrape down the bowl 1 more time. We're going to mix it just a couple of 30 seconds, and then we're going to put it in the pan. Okay, as you can see, the flour has piled up on the blade. You definitely want to be aware of that and scrape that down, because the flour and everything has to be really well mixed. Otherwise, strange things will happen with your cake. Okay, so we're scraping it down and we're going to mix it another, 30 seconds. Despite our best efforts, we still missed a couple of spots in terms of buttering and flouring the pan. Now that is likely where the cake will stick, but since we know that going in, And I guess one technically could try to put some more butter and flour on it, but sometimes you just do the best you can do. Just turning this around, you notice this is a very thick batter. Some batters are loose and watery, but this one is thick, almost the consistency as a pudding. And when you are putting it in the pan, if you were doing this by yourself, it's a little bit tricky.
Put all of it in?
Yeah. How we have about maybe an inch above the batter for the pan. That's sort of pushing it. It might go over, but then again, maybe not. With this kind of cake with a thick batter, sometimes you get air pockets. So you always want to drop it. Any air pockets will dissipate when you do that. Okay, another little trick. So now we are ready to put our cake in the oven. Okay. Yay! And let me just point out, because I can already see a problem. You see how those two racks are? You don't want them like that. You want the cake pretty much in the middle of the oven. So the low one is too low, the high one is too high. You want the cake about in the middle. And you want it in the middle of the middle. Okay? So more or less equal distance on both sides and front to back.
That's not the middle of the middle.
Okay, go ahead, adjust it. The other thing too,
Is that? Oh,
okay,
close enough.
is this cake takes about an hour to bake in a conventional oven, and so I usually use the timer, and I usually like to look at it in 30 minutes. So Ashaki, can you set the timer for 30 minutes? We have two issues going on here. Just pull that out, that looks pretty good. To test, don't move it out yet. We're gonna see if it's done, right? Okay, when it's wet like that, it ain't done. So just push it back. When you get wet like that, it's not done. You can use a cake tester. In the olden days, we used to use a straw or toothpick, but I found that a knife works just as well. So when it's wet like that, you saw how nice it looked on top? This means it has at least another 30 minutes of baking. Okay, when you're doing something for the first time or for a very special event, you really don't want any variables. So here the variable is my daughter's very new fancy oven, which is also a convection oven, which I have never worked with, right? So like we were trying to turn off the timer, but instead we turned off the whole oven, right? And so our cake was in here for however long, baking, well not baking, well I guess it was baking, but it didn't, the thing wasn't on, the oven wasn't on. So another trick is when your top gets too done before the cake is done, cover it with a piece of foil, and that way the top won't get overly brown while the bottom is cooking. So now we testing it with our knife. You see that? Perfect, that's what you want. So that means the cake is done. So at this point we're taking it out and we're going to put it on the cooling rack over here. And as we said, we're going to let it cool for about 30 minutes and then we'll test it to see if it's cool enough for us to turn it out. But the main thing is just be calm. It's only a cake, it's not brain surgery. We have our cake. It has been out of the oven for about an hour, right? And as you can feel, it's still warm. It's not hot like it was. The key is you should be able to feel it warm, but able to hold it. Now, when it was hot, you couldn't hold it like that. Also, if you notice, you see how it started to pull away from the sides of the pan? That's when you know it's done, and hopefully it should come out easily. Now, just to be on the safe side, we always loosen it with a knife. If you try to take it out when it's all the way cold, it tends to stick in the pan. That's why you want it a little bit warm, but not hot, and you don't want it all the way cold. And then you also want to loosen it. Now the other thing, when you put your cake on a plate, you generally want a completely flat surface. Now most plates have like a curve kind of thing, which depending on the size of the cake can sort of, it's not the worst thing in the world. But if you can have a flat surface, that's why when they have those cake boards, they are completely flat. Now, this is the real challenge. This is how I do it. Everybody
drum
has
roll.
it.
Drum roll.
Yeah, drum roll. Everybody has it. So we got this special cake plate for the grandson's birthday. We're going to put it here, and then we're going to flip it over. Now sometimes the plate is too heavy. Now if we've done this right, voila! And so we have one little spot that got stuck. Sometimes the whole thing can fall apart. This happens also to be that section that we sort of didn't get all the butter on, but that shows you the importance of really buttering the cake. But see, we like the bundt pan because it gives you that pretty decoration. Now, the cake is still not completely cool. If we were doing a glaze, because this kind of cake you can do a lemon glaze, chocolate glaze, a ganache glaze. We're just going to do a little powdered sugar later on. But what we're going to do, we're going to let the cake get completely cool, and this could take another hour, right? The other thing you do not want to do until the cake gets completely cool is cover it. Because if you cover it at this stage, you're going to get condensation and funny things happen, right? So right now we're going to let the cake cool for another complete hour so that the cake is actually cold, and then we'll do the powdered sugar.